So far this session has definitely lived up to its promise, and I'm quite sure our third paper will continue this sterling innings. This is on India's experiment with mandated corporate social responsibility. And of course, Khanna is going to be the speaker.
Okay, well, thank you everyone for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here, and I appreciate the organizers for putting me after the two most exciting presenters I know, Yisha and Gabriel. I will do my very best to revert to the mean and make things a little more normal. Now, I'm going to be presenting about India's mandated corporate social responsibility provision. And for me, this is interesting because normally when I present to a finance and law audience, I'm presenting about white-collar crime, which might be treated as the dark underbelly of corporate practice. And I usually dress in all black to sort of indicate the angel of death nature of the role I take there. This, on the other hand, is a version of what corporations do that might be good. And the trouble is I couldn't find a white suit that looked plausible on me. So I decided instead to go for a light blue. So hopefully that will enhance the mood of most of the presentation. And this, of course, is co-authored work with Dhammika Dharampala, my frequent co-author and very good friend. So as many of you know, India's, well, before I get to India, the CSR literature is absolutely vast. I have an RA who checks every 2 weeks how many new papers there are on CSR. At recent count, it's 3,108, which is remarkable when you think about an area of scholarship. It crosses virtually every area of business and management and law you can think of. India does something that no other country has actually tried, which is that it mandates in some ways that firms that cross certain thresholds spend 2% of their net profits on CSR. And what's interesting about this, of course, is it's going to allow us to try doing certain kinds of empirical tests that other kinds of CSR things don't allow us to do. Because most CSR is voluntary, it doesn't allow you a good identification strategy. All right, here are our primary findings. We look to see what is the firm value effect as perceived by the market upon the first announcement of these reforms. What we find using a regression discontinuity analysis is that there's a negative 2.6 to 3.3% effect on those firms, and that effect is centered primarily on firms that do very little advertising. Now, one of the reasons we suspect that's the case is the firms that do advertising simply recategorize some of their advertising as CSR and hence don't have an overall bottom line effect. That insight comes from doing a lot of work on white-collar crime and being generally skeptical of a lot of things. The other thing that's perhaps interesting is the overall effect is actually larger than the mandate. So the mandate is to spend 2% of your net profits. The effect seems to be close to 3%, suggesting that in addition to the spending, there's some substantial other costs. I'll talk about this a little bit more in the presentation. We think compliance costs are actually not insignificant here, as well as executive time. We then go on and actually try to explore what is the CSR spending effects, because at the end of the day, the objective of this law was to, or at least one of the objectives, was to increase CSR spending. We use a diff and diff analysis here to examine what has happened in terms of CSR. We find an overall increase across the market, but a strange effect is those firms that were prior to the law doing more than 2%, which was not a huge number, but actually many of the big ones, all secularly declined to 2%. So the 2% serves as both a ceiling and a floor, which is interesting along many lines and is sort of, shall we say, some evidence in the corporate context of the notion that when you mandate voluntary behavior, you actually can crowd it out in some ways. I want to put a big caveat here. Our study is examining mandatory CSR, not the firm value effects of a voluntary approach to CSR, nor the social welfare effects, which are exceedingly difficult to measure empirically. But we do think we raised some interesting insights on these questions. Being a law professor, I thought that we should also talk about what we might do in the future and how that might relate to policy. It's interesting, the government in India could have opted for a straight tax. They do lots of these cesses and taxes in India. They could have easily said, we're going to have a cess of 2%. The money comes to the government, and then the government decides where to spend it. That's not what they did. Instead, they decided that they would have the companies be required to do the spending and then disclose how they're doing it. So the identity of the people making the decisions about where to spend this money is different than a simple tax. And we're going to talk a little bit about why that might be better or worse. Interestingly, in the Indian context, a lot of people would think that having the private parties do the spending is better than the government for a variety of competence and corruption reasons. We then go and look a little bit at where are the companies actually spending this money? What are they spending it on? And what we discover is it turns out that they're sensitive to their customers. What an amazing shock. They basically focus on things that are education and healthcare oriented that have deliverables within 1 to 3 years, which when we look at the Indian market, the demographics there makes absolutely perfect sense. The other thing that might be interesting to explore is since companies are now looking for outcomes, might they direct their CSR spending differently than, say, the government does? The government is typically not assessing the deliverables in the same way that a private entity might. Maybe firms are going to direct that spending in a way that may be less wasteful, perhaps, than the government. All right, that's the overview. Let's talk about the law. Love the law. India is the first country to require, on a comply-or-explain basis, some firms to engage in CSR activity. Section 135 has multiple parts. The first part is whether or not it applies. There are various thresholds here, net profits, net worth. You can ignore all of them except net profits. Why? The net worth and the sales turnover requirements basically capture, roughly speaking, somewhere between the top 25 to top 15% of firms. Net profits is a median firm. That's where they've set it, so it captures all of the above categories. That's going to be the real one. All right, what if you cross this threshold? What happens to you? You are required by law to form a CSR committee with at least one independent director, and they must formulate and monitor their CSR policy. You must disclose the composition of the committee. They have to disclose their policy, and they have to indicate what steps they took to make sure it happens. You're required to spend at least 2% of the average net profits of the last 3 years on CSR or explain why you didn't. That's the comply or explain. That is the only requirement that's comply or explain. Forming the committee, the disclosure of the committee, and those things, those are required. You can't comply or explain those. Finally, the Ministry of Company Affairs develops rules in 2014 to delineate what is CSR, right? What counts as CSR? It is exceptionally broad. For example, something done to alleviate poverty. I think that would include almost everything. As a result, the breadth of what you can spend upon is very, very large. But there are some limits. In particular, it cannot be something done to benefit your own employees. So, for example, starting a daycare at your facility for your employees, that's not going to be counted as CSR. But building a school next door for anybody in the community, that would be CSR. You cannot contribute to political parties. This is the inverse of Citizens United. That's kind of interesting. And you can't spend money outside of India. It has to be all local in India. These conditions give you the impression that this isn't exactly what CSR looks like in other places. It overlaps, like two Venn diagrams. But this is more about a form of like compelled charity, shall we say. We don't know yet. The law is relatively new. We don't quite know what exactly will be the enforcement provisions. I'll talk a little bit about that hopefully when we talk about the results. Okay, I thought since we're going to do an event study here, it's helpful to just highlight how this all happened. So initially, the Companies Act, the draft that came out eons ago in 2004, 2005, the Irani Committee, had no provision on this whatsoever. It was pretty much an afterthought as the gestation of the Companies Act sort of just lingered on and on and on. The main thing that happened was in December 2009, the Ministry of Company Affairs put forward a voluntary guidance on encouraging companies to spend money on CSR. And the reason for this was pretty simple. The perception was that after nearly 20 years of liberalizing the Indian economy, the gains of that liberalization seemed to be essentially centered on a very small subset of players. At least this was the perception, the larger corporates. And if you wanted to maintain political support for greater reforms and greater liberalization, there needed to be some indication that India Inc., the corporate sector, was contributing back to society. Optically, that could not be the government doing a tax, because remember, liberalization means essentially pulling the government back. Imposing a tax is kind of going the opposite direction. They wanted it to optically look like the companies were the ones directing the spending. That was actually the key political goal. After about 8 months of the government saying, please do this, the companies largely ignored them, which is typically what happens when you ask, please, please. And then in August of 2010, a report came out that the government planned to propose a new mandatory CSR rule that had exactly the thresholds that eventually became the law. All the detail was there in the very first news announcement. India Inc. immediately responded by saying, we don't like this, you can't compel charity, et cetera, et cetera. There was quite a lot of firestorm of debate in these 5 months, and basically by the end of 2010, the government switched it to a comply or explain rule, but the same thresholds were at play. So our key two event dates are going to be this. We run event dates on the other ones. Nothing happens. I won't waste more time on it. OK. So when you're doing an event study of this kind, your key concern is going to be basically identification. And since we're doing this in RD design, we're going to have to worry about things around the discontinuity. All right, so the key threshold is net profits. It's basically the median in the prowess data set. Net profits is one of those sort of data variables that's more susceptible, shall we say, to manipulation. So if someone didn't want to be subject to this rule, they could simply sort of shade their net profits a little bit down and be below the 50 million rupee threshold, the 5 crore threshold. So we look basically for whether we see that degree of manipulation. And basically what we find is there's not much bunching below the 50 million rupee threshold. There's a little, but not anything that's significant, right? The second thing that's kind of interesting is because we're worried about manipulation, we actually design our regression discontinuity test with a donut hole. That's kind of a strange description. That's just basically a way of saying, instead of looking just at this discontinuity, we push back about 6 or 7 million rupees and look even at 43 and see if there's a different effect to see whether you're capturing that. The other thing that's probably worth noting here is volatility. Just because this year your profits are 48 million doesn't mean that next year you won't cross 50 and then be subject to the law. So there'll be some subset of firms that are close to the margin, right, but are not actually over it, that may pass over and the market might anticipate that. That would contaminate your testing. To address that, we again use the donut hole with different kinds of hole sizes, so to speak, which goes from 1 crore to 2 crore to all the way out to 7. All right. So what you have here are the two basic, what you call charts here. We're implementing the RD using a non-parametric local polynomial. In English, roughly speaking, what that means is these are the data points. It's not immediately obvious that you should use a linear representation to graph that. So the non-parametric basically allows us to not be tied to the linear model. The polynomial allows us to do all kinds of things. So we actually do a series of these graphs to test, is there actually a break around the discontinuity? And this is roughly what it looks like. Pretty much any polynomial function you design here looks like this broken mustache, as I like to call it, where one side sort of goes here and the other side goes there. I find that to be an easier description because my son likes to draw a mustache on my face that looks like that. And then it takes me a week to wipe it off. To give you a sense as to what it might look like at other thresholds, like the fake thresholds, the 100 million 10 crores, then we do 15 crores and all of that, you see nothing. You see a clean mustache, right? Just kind of keeps going. That suggests there's no serious discontinuity at the other points. The only discontinuity we can actually find is right about there. That's consistent with the notion that the market is responding at the threshold and that the effect is largely negative. Okay. For those of you who like charts, here's a chart. Basically, this is the RD estimate. It's about minus 3%. It's significant at the 10% level. I wouldn't let yourselves be too worried about that. With an RD design dealing with this kind of a test, significance is important, but one doesn't obsess too much about 10%, 6%, whatever. All right, good. Now, let's talk a little bit about the actual spending effects. Okay, so we're interested in knowing not just how the market responds to these news, but also what do firms do once they're subject to it? How does it change their CSR spending? So we're going to gather proxies for CSR spending from social and community and environment-related expenses from prowess. We have that for 2012 to 2015. That's helpful because that basically goes on either side of the rule, which was in 2013. We should note that these are voluntarily reported data, so you're going to have selection issues. It's okay as long as the selection issues are the same throughout time. We're not worried about that affecting the time series in the same way. We're going to do a DID analysis here, panel data from 2012 to 2015. Here's basically since the diff and diff, what we're really looking for is the extent to which the treatment firm's CSR spending deviates from its pre-existing trend relative to the corresponding deviation for unaffected firms. We're doing this in first estimation. For those of you who are interested in the math, there it is. It's in the paper. I won't spend more time on it. Here's a chart, what we see here, right? Okay, so essentially what we're seeing here is an increase around the time of the law in the amount of spending that we see for firms that are going to be subject to it. Right? You see a sort of a large secular increase. What you see here in figure 5 is the fraction of firms that are actually doing more CSR. And this we think is quite intriguing because prior to the law, you have about looks like about 7% of firms that do CSR. The year after the law, you have 32%. This is a comply or explain rule. That is a remarkable increase in reported CSR. Now, I can't vouch for the fact that you report CSR means you actually spend it, or that what you're spending it on isn't just something random and useless, but it is actually interesting to see that large of an increase in such a short period of time. Okay, we decided then to probe the spending effects a little more closely because our sense was that when we looked at the data, advertising firms didn't seem to have a negative effect. They had a very mild negative coefficient, no significance, not even close to significance. So we dug a little deeper and basically found that most of the effect, the negative effect, is centered on firms that don't do advertising, which means this is a new expense item for them. Firms that do advertising can substitute between advertising and CSR because if you think all that advertising does is build goodwill, and you think all that CSR does is build goodwill, they're just, one's chocolate and one's dark chocolate. It's all pretty much the same. Right? And that's what we're seeing, especially in column 3, where you see the minus 2% effect on the firms doing advertising spending and pretty much nothing anywhere else. All right, thank you. I'll make this fast. So for those of you interested in the effect on the firms that were doing some CSR spending before, what we basically observe is all of the firms that were doing more than 2% before the law all drop down to 2% or very close to it within the next year and pretty much stay there. I went and actually interviewed a number of the CFOs and chief CSR officers at the firms. They had a very simple explanation for this. When the expectation was everybody did 0, doing 2% made, or 4% made you look really, really cool. Now when the expectation is 2%, we can't just do 4 to be that sort of special. We have to do like 10, and we just don't think it's worth the money. Instead, we'll drop down to 2, spend money on advertising, and get our goodwill that way. We won't waste time trying to stay at 4% or 10% or whatever we think we need to be at. We test for reversion to the mean. There isn't. Sorry? Yes, we actually do find effects on that as part of it. That's a good point. I won't do the discussion thing here because I think we've already started doing it. I do want to mention the policy issue here, which is why not just do this as a tax? Wouldn't this be much easier if you just structured it as a tax? And the interesting thing here is that the difference between a tax and this is who's deciding where to do the spending. When firm employees do it, in theory, they're going to be assessed on whether the spending they did generated something of value to the firm, right? If you're just willing to burn the money, you don't need to hire someone to burn money. Anybody can do that. You need a matchstick, right? If you're going to hire someone to do it, that means you're hoping to get some goodwill out of it. In theory, that means that they're better positioned to make decisions about getting deliverables than perhaps government officers are in this respect. And what we're looking for right now is basically data on where people are doing their spending. What we found thus far is most companies seem to report doing spending on education and healthcare. That's not shocking to us given the demographics of India. And the companies that are doing it are often doing it because they have a lot of young people working there, so that seems like a good retention policy in some ways too. What's interesting is they almost never do anything long term. So if they spend on education, it's a program that gets, the 6-month degree certificate program that gets you able to get a job immediately, and then they advertise this is how many people we've got jobs for. Healthcare, they're not building hospitals, they're giving you antibiotics that will make you feel better when you get sick. Anyway, I'll stop there. I'll look forward to your comments and discussions. Thank you, and sorry for going a little late.
So Nishit Desai is... Oh, okay, all right.
Hello everyone. So I'm Rahul Rishi from Nishit Desai Associates. I work with the social sector team at Nishit Desai, so I lead the social sector practice. So I think the topic that was discussed here is very much of relevance to what I do at my firm. The paper was well written, and I think it had a lot of information which gave a lot of new context to me. Essentially because as a lawyer we look more from the legal side of what a subject matter is, and we do not really a lot of time focus on certain economic or financial models or such other empirical reasons as to why a firm should or should not engage in CSR. I more or less agree with most of the points that have been discussed in the paper. Few of the anecdotal issues that I would like to add on here, based on what comments and rewards we keep getting from our clients. One thing which we did notice, and I also largely found its resonance in the paper itself, that a lot of medium tier firms or organizations are not very happy about the way they are being asked to carry out CSR as a mandate, because for them it's more of a negative impact it has on their business. I mean, it's more of a philosophical issue as to why they should or why they should not carry a CSI in the first place. But yes, for medium tier firms and companies, it's not a very win-win or a happy situation for them. For bigger firms, it's gone both ways. For example, companies like Tata's and other such big companies were already doing CSR, and they already had a good name in the market. Post CSR law, maybe their spending has reduced a little. We can also back it with the data that is publicly available. Even to this date, almost half of the mandated CSR spending is conducted by top 10 companies that are NSE listed, and 1/3 of them are conducted by public sector units. So we do not see a lot of spending or initiative from especially IT firms that are hovering around the financial trigger that is under CSR law. One of the reason also could be that most of these IT companies that have their client base abroad do not really worry much about how they are being looked at in India or among Indian customers. So in terms of the customer interface that a company has, that will have that may have a direct impact on how they would want to be seen or perceived vis-a-vis wanting to spend or not wanting to spend. In fact, Live Mint had carried out a very good report this year, and also it was carried, Indian Express had also done some investigation on this, and they said that companies, despite falling under the financial trigger, choose to not spend and simply state reasons for it. One of the reasons could also be that most of the companies still do not see CSR in terms of in terms of a strategy and more as a pure legal compliance. A lot of times we get queries from our clients saying that, look, all that we need to do is to draft our CSR policy and get done with it. We don't really want to spend on the ground. So the findings that was shared in the paper is very much what we also believe that is something which is happening on the ground. On the question of, so one point that I would want to add here on the question of CSR being seen as a tax, I think it's again more of a philosophical a question, because again if you would want to see it as a tax and the government would, let's say, put a cess on it, then it would again be very much subject to the way government would want to spend it based on their political priorities. Even to this date, most of the CSR fundings is not very much available for areas in the northeastern parts of India or in eastern parts of India. So again, making it more centralized and not allowing companies to spend it may also be a little disenfranchising for companies or for their local ecosystem. So I think that is one point that I wanted to share here. So yeah, I think that those are more or less my comments. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, so questions. Okay, let's go around again, starting with Renika.
I have two questions and one comment. One is similar to what the discussant said about, do you see different effects at different firm sizes? So a 2% would mean a lot for a firm that's at a threshold of 50 million versus a firm that's bigger. So it would be interesting to know what those effects are. Also, is what happens if you just explain and then don't do anything about, you don't comply, but you have a good explanation and that's it. So is there any movement on some kind of enforcement if CSR doesn't happen? And is there an effect on companies that just sort of explain? What are the differences in firms that just choose to explain and do nothing about it? So that would be something interesting to know. And finally, this CSR rule is coming at a time where funding for funding from foreign funding agencies in India is going down. And to some extent, people are sort of trying to look at CSR money as a way of replacing the money that you would get from a Ford Foundation or a DFID or etc. And so there are interesting possibilities in how this CSR money could get spent. And perhaps, I mean, that's not directly relevant to the paper, but I just wanted to make a point about the social context in which this is happening.
So I just have a few details about the CSR program and perhaps a few questions. So first is, my understanding is that the threshold of CSR is computed on the 3-year average profit. So does that get taken care of in your, it's not that year's profit, but 3-year average profit. The second issue which sort of bothers me is the tax link to CSR. One is, in the earlier regime, if you did some charitable activity or you were spending on CSR in a voluntary sense, it was a tax deductible expense because you were showing it as an expense on your books. Now, under the new setup, I think CSR expenses are excluded from tax deduction. So you don't get any tax benefit there, and that could be one of the reasons why you see them congregating around the 2%, because anyway, if you're not going to get any tax benefit out of it, perhaps it's just best to do what you're mandating. The third is, I'm not quite clear about the manner in which these allocations get pooled. So for example, in this year I have to provide 2%, and I did not manage to spend it. Does that get created as a reserve, or I just move over to the next year and it's 2% of the next year? If it is a reserve and it's an unspent reserve lying on my books, it's something that perhaps I can observe and take a look at. So that's it.
Hi, thank you for the presentation. So one of the points that probably Renuka mentioned is the context for this CSR law and the context for the Indian ecosystem, where you got more than 10 times the listed or unlisted private companies, you got not-for-profit organizations. So that context, and also why the FCRA law came in. But more importantly, for the listed space, it would be very interesting to find out. You mentioned you've talked with many CFOs, the misgovernance in the CSR activity, where you've got people watering their gardens under the name of CSR, or having their kith and kin sit on as CSR chairperson on the bodies.
Vic, this was really interesting. I think one question I wanted to ask from a conceptual standpoint is, do you see the continuance of this rule and compliance with this rule as a potential shaper of corporate law duties going forward? In other ways, does it change the texture, the tenor of the duty that directors owe to a wider cohort of people than just their shareholders? Coming to Margaret's work, do you see the advent of CSR potentially creating a more proactive corporate duty to service the community in a real sense that is potentially enforceable going forward?
I have a question actually. So what the Act also does is that it requalifies what CSR is. So you have Schedule 7 and you have those bunch of activities. So I was just wondering, before the Act, the expenses, so under the new Act, for everybody's benefit, the company cannot take activities which are mainstream to its business and call it CSR. You have to go over and beyond your area of business. So maybe that is one of the reasons why we see that anchor effect of 2%, because earlier what all you could do was coming under CSR, but now you're limited by the scope of law. One is that slightly academic question, is that responsible for anchor effect? And secondly, in your qualitative interviews, did it come out as a cause of concern that maybe if we were allowed to explore our business adjacencies, we could have had a more effective CSR as compared to the one that we're doing now? Thanks.
Great. I think there's one more person.
So I just wanted to say I love the finding that when the government forces you to do something, it actually has the effect of people doing less of it. And I didn't get the net effect. Is there more money being spent overall on this charitable work or less, based on the two effects you found?
Thank you. Thank you very much for all the comments, and I'll try to respond quickly because I'm guessing I have about 2 minutes. Okay. So thank you, Rahul, for your comments. I agree with most of what you've said there too. It is interesting. I think that when we did start talking to firms, it was the largest firms that were the most upset by the requirement. And I think primarily because they felt that their differentiator was now being diluted, more or less. Small firms found this to be annoying because it's a cost and they didn't think they would be able to scale up to a level that would generate like a deliverable that they could then advertise. So for them, it's just basically a waste of money from an advertising perspective. All right, on the other comments. So there are firm size effects, as I just suggested. The main ones are that the firms that were the biggest players in CSR, we tried to see whether their declining down in their CSR spending had a negative effect on them. It doesn't appear to have had much effect one way or the other, which is intriguing. The second thing, what happens when you explain? So a lot of the explanations are comical. So for example, a very common explanation is we couldn't find anything to spend the money on. So, you know, that seems hard to believe, to be honest. Just looking at the environment, that seems implausible. There's a sense in which we don't yet know how the market's responding because the enforcement apparatus for this is still sort of being developed, which is very common in the corporate governance space in India. There's sort of a grandfathering in period, about 2 to 3 years, and then after that, they might get a little strict on you. Your comment about the foreign NGOs, yeah, that's, we're trying to see if we can actually get data on what money NGOs get from Indian corporates, but it's actually remarkably difficult to get that data, primarily because NGOs are, many of them are really, really poorly reported upon. Sometimes they actually double count contributions, which makes you wonder what they're doing. All right. On your questions, Anjali, on the 3-year profit average, yes, it's 3 years. I presented 1 year just because it's easier than presenting 3 years, but if you do 3, it looks exactly the same. The tax link. So the CSR rule doesn't actually change whether or not something is taxable, but the law is clear that doing something as CSR does not by itself make it tax deductible. What determines tax deductibility is just the Income Tax Act, basically.
If, for example, in an earlier, I gave some money to hire teachers in a school, or I donated some, I could include that in my expense, and because it was an expense, I got a reduction and hence less tax. Right. Now, CSR is specifically expenses made under the head of CSR are specifically excluded from tax, except a few heads which have been laid down in some section 30 to 36.
I think, I would like to take that question up. So, in response to your question, so there are 2 things here. One is that when we look at the tax deductibility angle, we have to look at it purely from the viewpoint of you wanting that tax deduction in terms of complying with CSR law, or you wanting that tax deduction when you carry out your CSR activities in general. So let's say when I carry out a CSR activity under 135 of the Companies Act, under section 37 of the Income Tax Act, I would not be eligible to claim deductions. However, as a company who would carry out CSR in general without having to be casted either inside or outside of 135, you would be allowed deductions. So we have to understand the difference between the two.
Yes.
Does that cause the 2% to drop?
Well, the tax deductibility should reduce the negative effect even more, right? So if you're burning 2% of your assets, but you're getting the government to cover 1/3 of it, then the loss you should suffer is approximately 1.3%. Even if you don't get the tax deductibility, it should be 2% at the most. Assuming some things are tax deductible and some aren't, you would have a blended average of, like, say, 1.7. You're getting double that as a negative. So there's something else going on besides the exact cash flow effects. Let's see, you had a question about reserves. We have absolutely no idea how they're going to deal with this. The fact that you didn't hit your target this year, but next year, does that sort of accumulate like a preference dividend? Nothing is stated in the law about that. The authorities haven't released any official statement. Rahul may know a little more.
Carry forward is not allowed.
Yeah, there you go. It just lapses.
Yes.
So there you go. All right, in terms of the third comment here, which was about misgovernance and CSR spending. Oh yes, quite a lot. Some of the CSR spending is strange. They spend on, so certain government projects are count as CSR. If you contribute to certain government projects, there's been some anecdotal reporting that some companies have paid money to a government agency, and then lo and behold, the government agency goes defunct and returns money, about 80% of it, back to the company. which looks like someone just charged you a 20% premium to launder your money back for you. But that's anecdotal, so I don't know what to make of it. Then the continuance of the rules and what impact it might have on sort of other regarding behavior, moving away from the shareholder primacy norm. So under the 2013 Companies Act in India, the duties of directors run to all stakeholders already. That is actually a change. Prior to 2013, the perception was that directors were supposed to think about other stakeholders with respect to how it benefits the company. Now it's explicit. You just do it for the benefit of all stakeholders. You can view that as being part and parcel of it, but those two developments didn't coalesce at the same time. And then someone was asking, I think, whether the anchoring effect is because it's not ordinary course of business, right? So that depends on how closely that's being policed. We have no way to know that yet because the government hasn't actually started enforcing this in a serious way. They keep talking about it, but that's standard practice in the corporate governance area in India. You begin by putting out a rule, and then you essentially don't enforce it for 2 to 3 years. You do a lot of hot air on it, and then maybe after 3 years you'll see some enforcement response. Your question at the end there, do we see a net increase or a net decrease? Oops, that's okay, you don't need to, didn't hit me. Amongst all firms in India, the overall net effect is positive. If you limit yourself to the top 100 firms in India, the amount that the firms spent that increased is matched by the amount that firms spent that decreased. Now, the reason that's significant is the top 100 firms in India presumably are spending at a level that would generate an effect. The smaller firms in India, if they're just spending, 3 lakh rupees on some CSR thing, it's not going to do anything, basically. That's just a waste of money, most of the time. So there's a sense in which you might have increased the overall spending, but because you're reducing the critical mass, you might actually be having a negative effect. That suggests there might be a market for aggregators of CSR spending in India, and there are actually online platforms that are trying to get companies to contribute to them to aggregate the amount so that it passes the critical threshold to actually do something. Thank you.
Okay, give a good round of applause for all the people who presented, because I think they did a great job. Okay, come on.